All right, Esther chapter 8. When we look at this entire book that we've been in now for a number of weeks, we've seen that although the book doesn't mention the name of God at any point, yet you see his hand working in his providence all throughout each chapter and on every page, it seems. But when you think about the book of Esther, and you think about what's important about this book, and to answer that question, you obviously have to step back and look at the entire storyline of the Bible, what God's doing. And we know that the storyline of the Bible is that God's working a redemption out for his people to bring him glory, to provide our greatest need. And it begins back in the book of Genesis with the promise that God gives to Adam and Eve in Genesis 3, right? After their fall into sin, God promises them that one's going to come from the offspring of Eve who will crush finally the head of the serpent. Even though he will bruise his heel, through that bruising, he will crush Satan's head and end the curse that's justly on humanity because of our sin. And then from that time on, once Satan hears that promise from God to Adam and Eve, you see repeated attempts in the scripture to squash the people of God so that that promise of Messiah can't come. So we see it in the book of Exodus with the babies that are born and thrown into the Nile River. We see it throughout the Old Testament where it seems as if Satan is constantly tempting the people of God to be so wicked that God would just do away with them. And he can't do that, obviously. And then we see post-Old Testament and the New Testament, you see, the instance with Herod trying to get rid of the baby boys. Again, these are all Satan's attempts to thwart what God had promised him, that there would be a Jewish boy that would be born, and through him, Satan's demise would happen. And so in the book of Esther, what you have is another attempt by the enemy, by Satan, to wipe out God's people with the goal of wiping out Messiah. And we know he can't do that. He wants to do away with the promise of God against him, but we know that God doesn't make threats, he makes promises, right? And so that's what, so in reality, our eternity hangs on what happens in this book. Because if Satan can manage to succeed in wiping out Israel, which he's trying once again to do through Haman, there doesn't seem to be any kind of overall reason that Haman would hate the Jewish people other than one Jewish man, Mordecai, wouldn't bow down to him. And because he wouldn't bow down to him, Satan uses that pride in Haman to ignite that anti-Semitism in his heart, leading him to try to slaughter and exterminate all the Jewish people. So you have another attempt here in Esther by the enemy to do away with Israel, and by doing away with Israel, doing away with Messiah. So there's a lot at stake in what happens in this book. And so tonight, as we walk through chapter 8, I want to walk through it on 4 different words, and then we'll conclude with 4 different applications as we go through the chapter verse by verse. So number 1, look at the word blessing, verses 1 and 2. Blessing. On that day, so the same day that Haman is hung on the gallows that he intended for Mordecai, on that day King Ahasuerus gave to Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was to her. And the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. So it's the same day that Haman's life ends, on the gallows that he intended for Mordecai. So on that same day, King Ahasuerus gives his estate to Esther. So there was a law in Persia at that time that criminals when they were executed, their property became property of the state. And so now King Ahasuerus, he owns Haman's property, his estate, and he gifts it to his wife, to Esther. So just like that, everything that was Haman's becomes the possession of Esther. And remember all that Haman has and all the power that Haman had been given. Haman was the second most powerful man in the empire at that time. The only person that was more powerful than him was the king himself. And so he had all these possessions, all this estate, and in one day, just a few hours, God takes everything that was Haman's and gives it to Esther. So the enemy of the Jews has all of his belongings taken after his life is taken from him and given to this Jewish woman, Esther. And then Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was to her. So now Esther reveals the relationship between she and Mordecai, uncle and niece, sharing a common bond of their ethnicity, their Jewishness. And because she shares that with him, the king takes off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. You could maybe argue he takes it off of Haman's dead body, but I think it'd be more humiliating to Haman to remove that while he was still alive. Because that was he wanted that power. And so with that signet ring, remember what that signet ring signified? It was the authority of the king. So if you had the king's signet ring, you could operate in the king's power, with the king's authority. So with that ring, with that seal, you had the authority to do basically what you wanted to do within the approval of the king himself. And so when he takes that ring off of Haman's finger and he gives it to Mordecai, now Mordecai becomes the second most powerful man in the empire. And notice how quick the reversal is. Everything before that was going pretty wonky. Pretty squirrely for the people of God. And then in one day, everything flips on a dime. Esther is given this estate. Mordecai is made the second most powerful man in the empire. And then Esther gives to Mordecai the estate that the king had just given to her. And so there's this huge reversal of blessing that happens in the life of God's people. So that's blessing. Number 2 is pleading, verses 3 and 7. Pleading. Then Esther spoke again to the king. She fell at his feet and wept and pleaded with him to avert the evil plan of Haman the Agagite and the plot that he had devised against the Jews. So here you have Esther, same day, same series of events. She comes before the king. She falls at his feet. She begins to weep seemingly uncontrollably, pleading with him, begging him to undo the edict that had been written by Haman the Agagite, the plot that he had devised, his evil, his wickedness, to extinguish or exterminate the Jews. And when the king held out the golden scepter, verse 4, to Esther, Esther rose and stood before the king. Now, some argue about what exactly is the extending out of the golden scepter here. Is it similar to what had happened previously in the book? Or is it just the king saying, all right, you can arise and get up now? Because if she's crying uncontrollably, and maybe it's hard to understand exactly what she's asking for and what her rationale is. And so he extends that golden scepter for her to arise and to approach him and to sort of speak what she wants, what her request is, what her pleading is. So he holds out the golden scepter to Esther. Esther then rises and stands before the king, and she said, if it pleased the king. Notice the words that she used. Now, this is typically of how you would address the king in the court, right? But there's also great wisdom in how she's asking this of her husband, of the king. She said in verse 5, if it pleased the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and if the thing seems right before the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes. She's in a sense buttering him up as much as possible, sort of heaping praise upon him, because she's about to ask him to do something that she knows that he can't legally do at least the way that she's asking for it. And he's already done so much for her and so much for her uncle. And so she's sort of pleading with him, and she's buttering him up. She's being as favorable, as complimentary, as honoring to him as she can. And notice what she asks, what she pleads. She says, "Let an order be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, which he wrote to destroy the Jews who are in all the provinces of the king." Now, again, notice her wisdom. She makes sure she words her request in such a way that the king doesn't feel like she's placing the blame on him for what happened. Because remember, the king was duped. I mean, he was somewhat deceived in what was happening and what Haman was doing and his rationale, his reasoning. And so Esther, in asking and pleading for this request, she asks it in such a way as to make sure that she puts the blame where it is rightly to be placed, and that's on Haman and his wicked schemes, his evil heart, and what he had devised to happen to the Jewish people. And so she's asking for that edict to be undone. And notice her reasoning, her rationale, verse 6. "For how can I bear to see the calamity that is coming to my people? Or how can I bear to see the destruction of my kindred?" So her reason is, it's not enough that I live. If my people are destroyed, then what good is it for me to be alive? So she has this anguish in her heart, this sorrow in her heart, this deep sadness in her heart of what potentially could still happen, what will happen to the Jewish people if something is not done, because there's still that edict out there. There's a day coming in the future where everyone in the province, or everyone in all the provinces of the empire, are given the authority by the king to wipe out the people of Israel. And her rationale is, how can I stand to watch that happen? How can I sit in the palace, even with all the estate, all the possessions, all the property I've been given, and know that my people are being destroyed? How can I bear to see the destruction of my kindred? So that's the pleading. Okay, verse 7, you see a rewriting. Verse 7, "Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and to Mordecai, the Jew, 'Behold, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows because he intended to lay hands on the Jews. But you may write as you please with regard to the Jews in the name of the king, and seal it with the king's ring. For an edict written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's ring cannot be revoked.'" So he rehashes all that he's already done. He says, I've given you Haman's house, his estate. I've had your enemy hanged on the gallows because of what he intended to do to the Jews. And then that word that begins verse 8, "But you may write as you please with regard to the Jews." It's as if the king is basically saying to Esther, look, I've already done a lot. I mean, I've already taken out your enemy, and I've given all of his stuff to you. And even though I've done all that already, yes, even so, you can do this that you're requesting, right? "But you may write as you please with regard to the Jews, and do it in the name of the king, and seal it with the king's ring that now Mordecai has. For an edict written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's ring cannot be revoked." So again, he's reverting back to the law. He's reminding her, I can't really do what you're asking me to do. I can't just undo the edict, because once it's written and sealed, there's no going back from that. But basically he's saying you can rewrite a new one that can help offset the former one. So that's the rewriting there that's beginning in verse 7. Now look at verse 9. He gives this authority to Mordecai. "The king's scribes were summoned at that time in the 3rd month, which is the month of Sivan, on the 23rd day." So it's been 2 months and 10 days since the writing of the first edict. Now think about that. For 2 months and 10 days, the Jewish people have lived in basic terror of what's coming. I mean, if we were told on a certain day coming in the future, everyone in Macon and Bibb County, without any kind of fear of what the law will do, has perfect liberty and authority to kill every Christian, you would live with a great fear. That would be terrorizing. And that's the kind of life that the people of Israel had lived under, that threat, knowing that that day is coming, for now 2 months and 10 days. But now, because things have flipped, Mordecai has the ring of the king, and the king then summons all the scribes to put them at Mordecai's disposal to rewrite or to write a new edict to do whatever Mordecai commands concerning the Jews. He commanded concerning the Jews, the satraps and the governors and the officials of the provinces from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces, to each province in its own script, to each people its own language, and also to the Jews in their script and their language. So he equips Mordecai with everything he needs to make sure that every single person in the empire, every province, every language, knows what the new edict is. Because if they don't cover everyone, then the whole thing can go haywire. Because if everyone doesn't have the new edict in their language, and they can still operate on the old edict, not knowing that the Jews have been given the liberty to defend themselves without recourse from the government. And so he equips Mordecai with everything he needs to rewrite or to write a new edict. And notice what happens in verse 10. He wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed it with the king's signet ring. Then he sent letters by mounted couriers riding on swift horses that were used in the king's service, bred from the royal stud, saying that the king allowed the Jews who were in every city to gather and defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate any armed force of any people or province that might attack them, children and women included, and to plunder their goods. When you read this edict and you compare it back to the original edict in chapter 3, verses 12 through 15, the two side by side are meant to be this sort of mirror image of each other. You know, what Haman writes and what Mordecai writes are completely opposite of each other, but the vernacular, the words that are used are almost identically the same, but it's just the flip side of it. So instead of all the other peoples being given all this authority to kill the Jews now are given all this authority to defend their lives, even if it means killing those who attack them, taking vengeance upon them. Verse 12. On one day, throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. So that's the day in the future they're allowed to do this. And notice that it includes the women and the children. And there's a lot of debate about exactly what that means. But I think maybe the safest interpretation is that if there are women and children that actually come against the Jewish people, then God says they're fair game. If they're going to take that action against you, then yeah, I know they're women and I know they're children, but they're making their own choice at their own peril. And even if they're a woman, even if they're a child, if they attack you, then you get to take vengeance upon them. Defend your life, even if that means killing them. So a copy of what was written was to be issued as a decree in every province, verse 13, being publicly displayed to all peoples, and the Jews were to be ready on that day to take vengeance on their enemies. So the couriers, mounted on their swift horses that were used in the king's service, rode out hurriedly, urged by the king's command, and the decree was issued in Susa, the citadel. So here you have the new edict going out throughout the entire empire about this day of vengeance that the Jews are allowed to take to defend themselves against the first edict that would threaten their life. So you have blessing, you have pleading, you have rewriting, and then fourthly, verses 15 through 17, we see rejoicing. Look at verse 15. Then Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal robes of blue and white, with a great golden crown and a robe of fine linen and purple, and the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. Now compare chapter 4, verse 1 with chapter 3, verse 15. The first edict is written, and in chapter 3, verse 15, you have Mordecai's response, or how it affects him, or how it affects all the people. The couriers went out hurriedly by the order of the king, and the decree was issued in Susa, the citadel, and the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was thrown into confusion. Chapter 4, verse 1, when Mordecai learned all that had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the midst of the city, and he cried out with a loud and bitter cry. And now, as he writes the second edict, he goes out from the presence of the king in royal robes of blue and white, with a great golden crown and a robe of fine linen and purple. And the city is not thrown into confusion anymore. They are shouting and rejoicing. And the Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. And in every province and in every city, wherever the king's command and his edict reached, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, a feast and a holiday. And then lastly, and many from the peoples of the country declared themselves Jews, for fear of the Jews had fallen on them. There was sort of this mass conversion that took place, where other peoples, other nations, other ethnicities, they decided to come over and become Jewish. Now, there's two ways to look at that. You can basically look at it like, okay, they're saving their rear end, right? You know, they've seen the writing on the wall, so to speak, and they're making sure they're on the right side of history now as this day of vengeance is coming in the future. But I'm not sure that's what the text is to be understood to mean. Because if they become Jews, what does that mean about them? If there's still a day coming in the future where people can take aim at the Jews and they become Jews before that day, what does that make them? Target. So now they're in the crosshairs if they make the decision to become Jewish, to follow the Jewish God and all those things. So that leads me to believe that this is not just them trying to save their own hide, but this is them seeing in real time the power of the Jewish God and how he's orchestrating and turning and flipping the script in so many ways. And they're like, why would we continue to worship these gods when this God is doing all this powerful stuff? He's showing his power, his providence in all these ways, and has completely reversed things so quickly in the favor of the Jewish people. So there's this great reversal, this great rewriting, this great pleading, and now there's this great rejoicing. And I want to take the rest of the time just to try to walk you through some application. It's a pretty simple text. It's simple to understand. But I want to apply it to our life, and then we'll conclude, and I'll turn it back over to Phil. Number one, don't judge the author of your life until he's finished writing your story. Don't judge the author of your life until he's finished writing your story. Consider Esther. At a young age, either as a little girl or a teenager, her mom and dad die. She becomes an orphan. Her uncle adopts her. They don't live in their homeland, so to speak. They're in captivity under the rule of a foreign government. At some point in the future, I believe she's taken by force into the king's palace. I don't think that you had a whole lot of choice in that. If he rounded women up to do with them what he wished, I don't believe you had the right in that day to say, no, I won't do that. If you did, then you would end up like Vashti, right? So she was taken placed in the king's palace to do what all those women were expected to do. And in the fall of that, she learns that there's this enemy that's trying to kill her uncle, and kill all of her people. At any of those points along those events in her life, there's a temptation there by the enemy to tempt Esther to say, look at your life. What kind of God would let you go through this? What kind of God would take your mom and dad at such a young age? What kind of God would have you thrust into this position in the king's palace and all that goes along with that? What kind of God would allow the extermination of his people to even be a possibility? And so there's this temptation that she had at multiple points throughout her life to look at what was going on in her present circumstances, her present experiences, and make a judgment call about the goodness or the power of God. If God loved me, he wouldn't let me go through this. If God were truly powerful, he'd be able to stop what's happening to me, to stop what's happening to our people. So there's all these temptations throughout her life to make a judgment call about who her God was and his deficiencies and his inadequacies and his insufficiencies based on what was happening in her life. But we know how her story ended. At all of those points where there's that temptation, the reality is that God was not done writing. And as a matter of fact, without all those other points that were difficult and hard and made no sense, I don't know if the story ends the way it ends without all the pain and all the suffering that preceded it. And it's like that with us, right? You and I can be tempted at different points along our journey to look at our present circumstances and situations that maybe aren't what we would have written for us. And the enemy wants, in those moments, do the same thing that he would tempt Esther to think, is that God doesn't love you. God doesn't have a plan for this. This is out of his control. He messed up. And if we give in to that temptation, we forget that the story remains to be finished. And that just may be, just like with Esther, that without all of those painful things in the past and those painful things in the present, that the future wouldn't be what it's going to be when God gets done writing. So don't judge the author of your life until he's finished writing your story. Number 2, the blessing of your rescue should make you desire to see others rescued. Experiencing the blessing of your own rescue should make you even more so desire to see the rescue of others in your life. Esther was not content that she was safe. It wasn't enough for her that she and her uncle Mordecai were going to live. I mean, wouldn't that be a temptation? Say, well, hey, I'm safe. I'm safe and secure here in the palace. It doesn't matter what happens to the rest of the people across the empire. I'm all right, so that's all that matters to me. But remember what she said to the king. What was her rationale, her reasoning behind the pleading? Verse 6, for how can I bear to see the calamity that is coming to my people, or how can I bear to see the destruction of my kindred? Esther is basically saying, I just can't be the safe one. There's still people in danger that need to be rescued. So it's not enough that I'm rescued. There are others that have to be rescued as well. And I can't be content with that. I can't be at peace with that without doing whatever I can do to help rescue those people as well. Do you see the connection between our life in Esther's. We've been given an even greater rescue through Jesus Christ, who has come to live for us, die for us, rise again for us, to defeat our greatest enemy, our own sin, and Satan, the adversary that attacks our soul. And you and I can't be content to say, you know what, I'm okay. I'm safe. When we have family, and we have friends, and we have coworkers, and we have neighbors who aren't safe, who need to be rescued. So there should be this happiness about our rescue, but a discontentment about our rescue. That I can't just be okay with just me being okay. I've got to plead. I've got to beg. I've got to pray. I've got to do whatever it is that I need to do to make sure that other people know the rescue through Christ that I've been given as well. Wasn't that what Paul said in Romans chapter 9, verse 3? You remember that passage? He says, I am speaking the truth in Christ. I'm not lying. My conscience bears me witness in the Holy Spirit that I have great sorrow and unceasing anguish in my heart, for I could wish that I myself were accursed and cut off from Christ for the sake of my brothers, my kinsmen according to the flesh. I don't know that I've gotten there yet. Paul's basically saying, I'll give up my life for Christ if it means the salvation of others. Like, I'll forfeit my own salvation if that were possible, if in return it would mean the salvation of my people. So we have to have that discontentment about us that we've been rescued and we want others to be rescued as well. Number 3, Satan's schemes always serve God's sovereign purposes. We've seen that repeatedly throughout this book, so I'm not going to park here too long. But Satan's schemes always serve God's sovereign purposes. Everything that the enemy was doing through Haman, we saw last week, and the week before, God takes all those things that he was doing and then uses those things to destroy Haman. And that's what he did in the gospel, right? That's what he did in the life of Christ. Satan sort of uses the Roman government. He uses the Jewish leadership. He uses the Jewish people of that day to destroy Jesus on a cross. And in doing so, they're doing exactly what God wanted them to do. It was that scheming by Satan that God designed as his strategy to defeat Satan. The very thing Satan's trying to avert, promised to him in Genesis 3, God is accomplishing through those very same actions of Satan. And that's what he does in our life. The things that Satan intends to defeat us, to discourage us, to stop us, God says, you know what, I'm going to use those things, those moments, those circumstances that Satan intends for your destruction, and I'm going to use them to make you more like Jesus. Satan wants you to hate Jesus because of these circumstances. And I'm going to make these circumstances make you love Jesus even more. So Satan's schemes always serve God's sovereign purposes. And then lastly, number 4, because of future promises, there should be present joy. Because of future promises, there should be present joy. Did you notice? Look back at the end of chapter 8. The response and rejoicing of the Jews. Verse 16. The Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. And in every province and in every city, wherever the king's command and his edict reached, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, a feast and a holiday. There's this great rejoicing that's taking place among the Jewish people. But the day of their deliverance is still in the future. Like, it's not been given yet. Like, it's not happened yet. The promise of their rescue is off in the distance. But their joy is present that day because of a promise to be fulfilled in the future. God's made you and I a bunch of promises, some of which are still in the future. So a few of those. In the book of Philippians, chapter 1, he who began a good work in you will be faithful to complete it. Do you still feel unfinished? Yeah, I'm unfinished. But God's promised me in the future that what he started in me, he'll bring it to completion. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 17 through 18. Here's God's promise. For this light, momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison, as we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal. God says your present suffering, as heavy as it seems, is but light and momentary in comparison to this eternal weight of glory that's coming. It's a promise in the future that should bring joy in the present. Psalm 143 verse 12 says, and in your steadfast love you will cut off my enemies. And listen to this, you will destroy all the adversaries of my soul, for I am your servant. God says one day, everything that's attacking your soul, I will destroy. I'll take care of every single threat. Again, a promise in the future that should bring us present joy. And then maybe the ultimate one is Revelation 21. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more, neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore, for the former things have passed away. God says the things that wreck your life right now and that cause you intense sorrow and pain, one day will be no more. And the only tears that you will cry are tears of joy. No more tears of sadness, no more brokenness, no more death, no more dying, no more sickness. Again, that's a future promise that God intends for us to have present joy at what he's promised us he's going to do in the future. So the question to us is, how much present joy do those future promises bring us? Because oftentimes we let life suck the joy that we're to have in the present because of those future promises, because all we can see is the present sadness and the present sickness and the present difficulty. And we lose sight of the promise that God's made us, that there's a day of victory coming. And regardless of how difficult this day is, you can have joy in this day knowing that that day is on the horizon. In conclusion, there's a word that was coined by J.R.R. Tolkien. It's a word that he made up, and it's the word eucatastrophe. Two words, E-U, good, combined with catastrophe, which means a sudden turn of events. So we oftentimes, we understand a catastrophe as something negative, right? Like if there's a catastrophe, it was a negative, sudden turn of events. And Tolkien, he coined this word eucatastrophe. So a good, sudden turn of events is what is meant by it. He defined it this way. He said, the sudden, happy turn in a story which pierces you with a joy that brings tears. And that's what the book of Esther is. There's this sudden turn of events that brings unspeakable joy, like we see at the end of chapter 8. that results in tears of joy at what God has done. One pastor described it this way. He said, Esther's tale is a tale of great reversal. But it ought to remind us of the greatest reversal of all, when our Redeemer made satisfaction for sins, overcame death, rose in glory, and it invites us to wait for the day when we ourselves shall be swept up into participation in Christ's own victory in a eucatastrophe of our own. One day, remember, the trumpet of the archangel will sound, and Christ will split the sky, coming in glory with his angels, and every eye will see him, and we who believe will be changed, and the dead will rise, and heaven will be rolled up like a scroll, and the elements melt as in a fire, and books will be opened, and all the enemies of Christ and his church will be destroyed, and a new heaven and a new earth will open to us, the home of righteousness, where we shall be forever with the Lord face to face as the Lamb wipes away every tear from our eyes. There is a eucatastrophe coming. Christ has entered into it ahead of us, and one day he shall bring us up with him into it too. That's what the book of Esther is foreshadowing for us. It's showing us a small glimpse of a eucatastrophe and the events that are foreshadowing a greater eucatastrophe that God would accomplish through Christ's work on our behalf. Again, Tolkien's famed work was The Lord of the Rings. And the end of that trilogy, after Sam and Frodo destroy the ring in Mount Doom, and Sam is recovering from his journey, and he wakes up, and he says this. He looks at Gandalf, the white wizard. He says, I thought you were dead, but then I thought I was dead myself. And he asks this question. He says, is everything sad going to come untrue? What's happened to the world? And then Tolkien writes, Gandalf responded, a great shadow has departed. And then he laughed, and the sound was like music, or like water in a parched land. Esther reminds us, as a foreshadowing of what Christ is going to do and has done and will do, that one day a great shadow is going to depart. And there'll be joy across the land, joy in our hearts, joy fulfilled because of what Christ has done for us. Everything sad will come untrue because finally and fully that great shadow will have departed because of the finished work of Christ. No matter how catastrophic the world is, or your life may be, or my life may be, there is a great eucatastrophe coming, and it's all because of Jesus. When you read a Bible story like Esther, you're tempted to ask the question, well, who am I in this story? And I think we like to think that we're Esther or we're Mordecai, and that God's raised us up for such a time as this. And eventually I think God makes us into Esthers and he makes us into Mordecais. But if we're honest, we all start out as Hamans. That's who we all are. Enemies of God, rebelling against his rule and his reign, scheming, wickedness, and evil. And the gospel story, if we could encapsulate it, flip it around as we look at the book of Esther, it would be as if on that day when those gallows were constructed and Haman's guilt was found out, and it would be as if Mordecai stepped up to King Ahasuerus and said, you know what, King? I know I'm the wronged one. And I know Haman's the guilty one. I know he deserves to be hanged, and I deserve to go free. But I'll hang in his place. The innocent for the guilty. And that's what Christ did for us. That's how he began that eucatastrophe in our life that will extend throughout all of creation, where he takes a bunch of Hamans, dies in our place, rises again, finishes our story that ends with joy, no more tears of sadness, No more fear. A dark shadow has been taken away. And Christ rules and reigns forever and ever. Amen. All right. Phil?